So what I have noticed in my practice over the last few years is that children's health has really changed. We used to see a lot more simple or milder presentations of, immune issues or eczema or asthma, and now I'm seeing a lot more behavioral issues, and especially anxiety or severe anxiety in young children. And with the pandemic, I have two kids myself, and one of them suffers from anxiety. So with the pandemic, I noticed that there was a massive increase in this sort of presentation, along with, insomnia and various other issues, not just in adults, but in children as well. So, yeah, so it's really changed. I think there's quite a few reasons for it. Obviously, we've had the global pandemic. There's also a lot of other factors, including overscheduling. So many children are overscheduled with what they're doing with their lives. There's no time for free play or even just playing in nature. There's too much screen time, and that's impacting, especially the adolescents that I see. They aren't getting enough sleep because they're on their screens. So that's impacting the circadian rhythm, and the gut connection. So our diets are a lot poorer than they ever used to be, especially with children. And one of the main nutrients that is so important for the nervous system is magnesium. And we know that the magnesium rich foods are the foods that children generally don't love. So the green leafy veggies and things like that. But even if they were eating all these beautiful foods, the problem we have, especially in Australia, is that the soil is so deficient. So Australia is a really old land. Our soil is really deficient in a lot of crucial minerals, including magnesium and zinc, which I'll talk more about. So even if they were eating correctly, supplements can sometimes be really useful. And I do have a lot of people asking me, we didn't evolve having supplements. Why do we need supplements now? Well, the reason is that our soils are so much poorer than they ever used to be. So we used to eat all these beautiful foods, but the soils were a lot richer in minerals. If you look at a country like New Zealand, which has traditionally a much richer volcanic soil, and you compare that to Australian soil, you'll really see that it's so deficient. Along with, if you eat meat, the meats, the wild game, were much higher in omega-3 fatty acids, whereas if you look at the farmed animals, they're much lower and much higher in that the kind of saturated fat. So there's that big link there between the gut and our mood. I mean, people don't realize, but 80% of serotonin is actually produced in the gut and not the brain. So what you eat is absolutely crucial to how you feel. Our immune system is constantly sampling into our gut and talking with our brain through the vagus nerve. So I'm sure other people will talk about the vagus nerve today, but that can be really important to look at. So when I see a child or an adult, I always try and do some in-clinic tests. One of them is iridology. So I'm that old-fashioned naturopath that uses iridology in every consultation, because I find you get so much insight into the nervous system, the gut, the lymphatic system, the immune system, just by looking in someone's iris. And what I commonly see, especially in kids, but also in adults, is stress rings. So they look like contraction furrows. They can go all the way around the iris. And that's often when someone's in that constant fight or flight that Jennifer was talking about before, where their pupil is changing shape so rapidly that it actually causes these kind of creases in the iris bed. And that is a big sign that they're in fight or flight, and they are they have a big need for magnesium. So one of the main ways that you can see if someone is in fight or flight through iridology is by simply shining a light in their eye. And if their pupil doesn't constrict in the way that it should, and it starts to open up and do this sort of movement, you can assume that they have some level of fight or flight. And that is a chronic sort of stress response where they need to really be shifted out of that fight or flight. And I do it with herbs and nutrients, and I'll talk a bit more about it, but lifestyle is also really, really crucial. So if there's any sort of anxiety, naturopaths really believe in going back to the root cause and really finding out what is the root cause. Is it genetic? Is it diet? Is it lifestyle? Is there something going on at school? And really sitting down with your patient. I mean, different from a GP, doesn't have as much time with your patient. I spend at least an hour with my patient initially and go through absolutely everything. So we might look at blood tests. I always like to cross-refer. I have a few GPs that I cross-refer back and forth to, which is brilliant. And we'll look at things, like the minerals. Minerals aren't that accurate through the blood. You can get a really good idea about zinc. I had a patient today and the doctor did the zinc and copper and said, oh, they're normal. But from my point of view, they're not in the optimal range. And that's why you want to maybe see a naturopath or a nutritionist, so you can look at optimal ranges. So you can look at things like that. I'm a big believer in testing for Pyrroles. I see a massive link between pyroluria and anxiety. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but I've written quite a lot about it I have a blog on my website that you can have a look at. But Pyrroles is really common in Australia. One of the reasons might be the lack of zinc in the soil. It's a urine test. It's non-invasive. I like to, especially with children, use tests that are much less invasive than, blood testing. And with the gut, you can look at stool testing. You can do hair testing for heavy metals and minerals. And ultimately, I like to do my treatments using really gentle methods, which is mainly herbal medicine and nutrients. So the herbs that I find really effective for adults and children, and I tend to mix all my herbs individually for each patient, are things like passion flower, oats, skullcap, lavender, licorice, withania. I use lemon balm, rhodiola, and romania. And depending on the presentation, if someone has more of a stress presentation or they're in that fight or flight, I use more herbs that are adaptogenic. So they're working on supporting the adrenal health. So they would be things like withania, rhodiola, romania. If someone has more of a nervous system and they're having panic attacks, there's a beautiful herb called kava kava, which comes out of Fiji. And that's really like calming and sodorific. And it's fantastic in a drop dose, even as a tea for panic attacks. And then there's other herbs that are more nervine, so they're more sort of calming and nourishing for the nervous system. Passion flower has a lot of research on it for actually helping people come off things like Valium. A lot of Valium is often prescribed for anxiety, and Valium is one of the hardest medications to get off. People don't realize how difficult it is to wean patients off Valium. And actually, there's a lot of research done on passion flower and how effective it is to sort of buffer that withdrawal. I love oats and skullcap. They're bitter herbs. They can be really useful, sort of nervous tension, headaches, and those sorts of things. If you imagine a lot of the herbs, there's something called a doctrine of signatures, where the herb looks like the body part that it helps. So with skullcap, you've got that aspect there. And then lavender, obviously, we all know the beautiful smell of lavender, but lavender is a beautiful herb to put in a mix for you've got perimenopausal anxiety as well, which is linked more with our hormones. But I would use lavender in a mix for that. And especially for insomnia, if you've got a very busy mind and you're really struggling to get to sleep, I might use lavender and California poppy in that mix. But it really depends on the presentation. So all my herb mixes are mixed individually. And so it's more of a tailored approach. With nutrients, like with children and adults, there's so much you can do with the diet, like that old, chestnut, more fruit and vegetables. Well, it's true, because what you eat is your microbiome is a direct representation of what you eat. So the more diversity in your diet, the more diverse your microbiome. So you really want to have a diverse microbiome. We know that the more diversity leads to better health outcomes. So those fruit, vegetables, whole grains, prebiotics are really important. And then they can really help with that vagus nerve signaling and, the amount of serotonin and GABA that's produced.